You would never spend $30,000 on a one-night party. You said it at the kitchen table. Your partner agreed. Then the venue coordinator called. One Saturday was left in the season. It was the date both families could attend, and the venue would hold it only until 6 p.m. The price of holding it was a $3,200 non-refundable deposit. Your parent was in the room when the call ended. They looked at the number, then at you. You only do this once. 10 minutes after calling a $30,000 party absurd, you paid the deposit. The kitchen still held the evidence. 2 cups of coffee were going cold. A calculator sat beside a sheet of paper that said $15,000, underlined twice in both your handwritings. The word wedding did not change the price of the party. It changed the category in your mind. The next morning, a cheaper venue appeared across town. It was a plain reception hall in the same suburban corridor, available on the same Saturday. It was not as beautiful, but the rooms worked. The parking worked. The smaller menu worked. The savings would make the original budget possible again. Then you remembered the $3,200. The call ended without a booking. You kept the first venue, and with it came the catering minimum. A smaller menu would not lower the minimum. A shorter guest list would mean paying for empty chairs. Leaving would mean losing the deposit. So you accepted the minimum. That was the first irreversible consequence. The cheaper venue had not disappeared. You had simply stopped treating it as cheaper because leaving felt like it would cost $3,200, even though that money was gone either way. The question had changed. It was no longer, which venue serves our budget? It was, can we bear losing what we already paid? No one was acting foolishly. You were avoiding a visible loss. You were protecting a date. You were honoring people who were already imagining themselves in that room. The next choice arrived as a spreadsheet. You and your partner started with a short list. Parents, siblings, grandparents, the friends who had been present throughout the relationship. Names appeared in rows and numbers in columns. You sorted them by closeness, then obligation, then what everyone might say. The venue minimum was already above your first estimate, so you looked for places to reduce. Then you reached the names that stopped looking like line items. Your partner's aunt had helped raise them. Your cousin had flown across the country for your engagement. Your parents had friends who had known you since childhood. Someone asked whether the people in the family group chat were included. Someone else said leaving out one sibling would create a conversation that outlasted the wedding. No one was trying to break your budget. That was what made the list grow without a fight. You were still looking at a spreadsheet, but it had become a map of relationships. A chair was an expense. A name was a message. You could say that a smaller guest list would save money. You could not say it without deciding what the smaller list meant. Which aunt would hear about it secondhand? Which cousin would stop calling? Which friendship would survive the wedding but not the insult of being excluded? So you added one name, then another. It was not one dramatic surrender. It was one explanation avoided, then one relationship protected. By the time the list stopped moving, it held nearly 110 names. The catering minimum was already in the contract. Once the guest count approached it, one extra chair looked almost free. Almost free is a dangerous phrase in a budget. Each additional guest seemed affordable. The meaning behind each invitation was genuine. Neither fact told you what the whole event would cost after the next decision. At the kitchen table, the original limit had belonged to you and your partner. Then your family offered to help. A parent said they could cover part of the meal. "It's our gift," they said. A week later, the money appeared in your account. Another relative offered to cover flowers or transportation. With the offer came a question. Had you chosen a color? Had you found a driver? The money arrived with love. It also arrived with a picture of what the celebration should include. That did not make the help manipulative. It did not make accepting it wrong. It meant money could carry expectations, even when nobody stated them as conditions. The question became harder to phrase. Were you protecting your own budget or declining something your family had offered because they wanted to see it happen? Overspending made you sound careless. Family pressure made your relatives sound cruel. Neither description fit. The real movement was quieter. Each contribution made one additional choice feel supported. Each supported choice made the next one easier to defend. Then the event acquired a standard that had not appeared on your original piece of paper. You opened your phone and looked at photographs from recent weddings. A friend's reception had long tables under warm lights. Another couple had hired a photographer who stayed from preparation through the last dance. Someone's dress had a detail you had never considered. Someone's suit fit perfectly. The flowers looked effortless, which probably meant someone had planned them carefully. You were not trying to compete. You were gathering ideas. But visible choices changed the background against which you judged your own. A plain table was no longer just a plain table after you had seen 10 decorated ones. A short photography package felt different after you had seen photographs from an entire weekend. The word basic started to mean something new. It no longer described a tablecloth. It described the distance between what you were planning and what you had just seen. Research on visible consumption offers a limited clue. Consumption standards can spread through social surroundings. That research was not about weddings, and it does not prove that any particular family copied wealthier friends. It supports a narrower point. What people see around them can influence what feels normal or acceptable. Your standard was moving before you could see how far the total had moved. The venue sent a revised package. You added the photographer because the shorter option felt risky. The short package was $900. Full coverage was $2,100. Between them stood one sentence from your partner. If we regret this, we can't redo it. The dress fitting reached the hem and stopped. Another appointment appeared on the calendar before the first one had ended. The suit needed work at the shoulders. The flowers were not extravagant, but the room looked unfinished without them. The menu offered a per-person upgrade that would make the evening easier for guests with dietary restrictions. Every decision was defensible. You did not feel extravagant while making any one of them. The photographer invoice arrived for $2,100. The alterations were $280. The flowers were $740. The menu change added another amount for every guest. The problem was not that any single line was impossible to understand. The problem was that each line was evaluated inside its own compartment. This is the idea behind mental accounting. People do not always experience money as one undivided pool. They give it labels. Wedding money, the deposit, the photography budget, money already spent. Those labels change how the same dollar feels. Then there was the once-in-a-lifetime exemption. That is our name for the pressure, not an academic term. When a purchase is framed as unique, unrecoverable, and emotionally important, ordinary spending tests begin to feel too ordinary for the moment. You do not ask whether the photographs fit this year's budget. You ask whether you will still look at them in 30 years. That is a real question. It is also the only question the invoice is being allowed to answer. You would not spend $2,100 on photographs of a random Saturday. But this was not a random Saturday. You would not accept a catering minimum for a party you were trying to keep at $15,000. But this was not just a party. You would not spend $30,000 on a one-night event in the abstract. But the total was still being assembled, so the larger question kept getting postponed. The credit card became the place where postponed questions went. First came the deposit, then the photographer, attire, transportation, and music. Each charge was attached to a date that still felt months away. The money left now. The emotional reward was scheduled for later. At first, the balance felt temporary. You expected the family contribution to arrive. You expected a refund. You expected ordinary income to absorb the rest. None of that was a complete plan. It was a way to keep the next decision from feeling final. Then the balance reached $18,700. You never sat down and decided to borrow $18,700. That was the strange part. You decided to book the venue. You decided to add the photographer, alter the dress, and upgrade the meal. The borrowing was the shadow of those decisions. It was real and recorded, but it was never the thing you felt yourself choosing. The $30,000 was the total cost. The $18,700 was the amount carried on the card. The difference came from income, the family contribution, and categories you quietly stopped funding that spring. The venue saw the deposit and signed contract. The photographer saw the invoice. Your family saw the guest list. You and your partner saw the balance, but not always together and rarely in the same emotional state. The total had no single room in which everyone had to face it. Federal Reserve household research provides useful context here. A large payment does not arrive alone. It has to coexist with rent, repairs, medical costs, transportation, and the ordinary uncertainty of the next month. A wedding is not an emergency. It does not need to be one for the balance to collide with the rest of household life. The future household you were building was already in the room. It simply had no invitation. The next pressure arrived through the same guest list. Only now, the spreadsheet was not a plan. It was a list of people who would notice a cut. Your partner noticed that the venue still had space. Your parent reminded you that the family was contributing. A friend texted that guests remembered good food more than expensive centerpieces. 3 people agreed in the group chat. Nobody mentioned the $15,000 note. None of the advice was malicious. None of it was neutral. Every comment pointed toward a version of the day in which cutting back would be visible. You could trim the guest list. You could choose the shorter photography package. You could return to the smaller menu. But every option now had a history. Changing venues would waste the deposit. Cutting the meal would look ungrateful. Removing a cousin would feel personal. The shorter photo package would feel like a future regret. The past was no longer behind you. It was arguing with every future option. This is the part of sunk cost pressure that is easiest to misunderstand. The deposit did not make the expensive venue a better deal. It made abandoning the venue feel like turning the previous payment into a visible defeat. Foundational experiments on sunk costs have documented the tendency to continue after money, effort, or time has already been invested. That is not a verdict on you. It describes a pressure that can appear in reasonable people making meaningful decisions. The shift is small enough to sound responsible. We have already committed to this. We can't change it now. We might as well make the most of it. Sometimes making the most of it is exactly what you want. Sometimes it gives the past authority over money you have not spent yet. By then, you were protecting the wedding you had already paid for instead of protecting the future you had originally discussed. The final guest count raised the catering bill. The photographer invoice was paid. The dress and suit were fitted again. The family contribution covered one category, which made approving another feel possible. A deposit was described as covered, so the remaining balance felt smaller than the original price. The budget note was folded beneath the contracts, like a receipt you were not ready to examine. By then, $15,000 no longer functioned as a limit. It functioned as evidence of what you had once intended. When the venue coordinator sent the final estimate, the number was not $15,000. It was close to $30,000. You read it once, then again. You did not send it to your partner immediately. You closed the document and opened it again, as if the number might belong to another event. Nothing on the page surprised you the way a single outrageous purchase would have. Every line looked familiar. Every line had arrived with a reason. A 2026 wedding industry survey of more than 10,000 U.S. couples who married in 2025 reported an average cost of about $34,000. That was an average among couples reached through a wedding platform. It was not a median, a requirement, or a definition of what a wedding should cost. Your total did not need to be unusual to matter. The problem was not that it made you an outlier. The problem was that it sat on top of a note that said $15,000. This is how a large expense becomes difficult to see while it is being created. The total appears at the end, while the meaning is present at every step. The event keeps asking a smaller question. Would you pay this amount to preserve what is already happening? The answer is often yes. By the time the larger question appears, the smaller answers have built the path. You and your partner reviewed the final numbers at the kitchen table, where the conversation had started. The vendor summary was on one phone, the credit card portal was on the other. The total was not a surprise to your eyes. You had typed it into spreadsheets. You had watched it grow while every individual charge looked reasonable. But you had never seen it sitting alone without the context of another decision. What surprised you was how it felt after the event. It was no longer an estimate, it was a balance. The $15,000 note was still on your phone in the same folder as the contracts and receipts. It had never been wrong. It had become a memory of a conversation held before the venue, the deposit, the guest list, and the expectations changed the landscape. The budget did not fail because it was too small to understand weddings. It failed because it stopped being treated as a decision rule. At the reception, none of the arithmetic was visible. People saw the room, the clothes, the food, the photographs, and the faces gathered together. They did not see the spreadsheet cell that became another guest. They did not see the cheaper venue you stopped considering. They did not see the budget note beneath the contracts. You saw the finished event too. You also saw the balance waiting afterward. You and your partner were not arguing about whether the day mattered. You were both crying in the kitchen. Neither of you raised your voice. You kept naming the future plans that would now have to live beside the balance. One of you said the money was worth it. The other said the money was real, even if the memory was priceless. Both sentences were true. A meaningful event does not become meaningless because it cost more than expected. Family help does not become worthless because it carried expectations. An expensive wedding does not make a couple irresponsible by definition. The point was never to rank celebrations by price. The point was to notice when the meaning of an event changes the tests you apply to its cost. For ordinary spending, you ask whether a purchase fits the broader life you are building. You compare alternatives, you wait. You look at the total. For a once-in-a-lifetime event, those ordinary questions can feel disrespectful. Measuring the cost can feel like evidence that you do not understand the moment. That is the exemption. It is not an exemption from arithmetic. It is an exemption from the emotional rules that usually make arithmetic persuasive. Once the event is unique, postponement feels like loss. Once the money is non-refundable, reduction feels like waste. Once family and friends are included, subtraction feels like rejection. Once you have seen what other couples have, basic feels like a public category. Once the balance is on a credit card, the future absorbs a decision the present keeps calling temporary. The party in the title leaves the price exposed. If someone asked you to spend $30,000 on food, music, photographs, clothing, and a room you would use once, you would want to discuss the consequences. You would ask what else that money could do. You would notice the lost flexibility and the plans that might have to wait. You said exactly that at this table. Then someone called it a wedding. The word did not change the venue, the menu, or the guest count. It changed what the price was allowed to mean. The money did not become imaginary. The financing consequences did not become symbolic. The opportunity cost did not disappear because the photographs were beautiful. The $3,200 deposit was never the largest number. It was the first number that could not become hypothetical again. Before the deposit, every venue was still an option. After it, one venue was yours and leaving felt like throwing money away. That commitment changed the emotional price of every alternative that followed. That is how a note saying $15,000 became a final total, near $30,000 without a single decision that felt unreasonable. The event may still be deeply valuable. That is the uncomfortable part. You do not have to choose between the wedding was worth it and the decision carried a cost. The celebration can hold love, family history, cultural meaning, and real joy. The balance can still restrict what happens next. Meaning and consequence can occupy the same sentence. Nobody at the reception intended to create that pressure. The pressure existed anyway. The first payment was not a moral judgment. It was simply a new fact in the household. It had to coexist with groceries, rent, repairs, and plans you had not told anyone about yet. You would never spend $30,000 on a party. That sentence was never proof that you did not care about celebration. It was a statement about what a large, one-night commitment would mean for the life around it. Calling it a wedding did not make the money less real. It made your ordinary limits feel too ordinary for the moment.